The storm had been raging for 3 days when Marcus Sullivan heard the desperate pounding on his cabin door. Lightning split the Montana sky as he stumbled from his chair, whiskey glass still in hand, beard unkempt from weeks of isolation. He wasn't expecting visitors, hadn't had any in the 2 years since he'd retreated to this remote corner of Glacier County to escape the wreckage of his former life. What he found when he opened that door would shatter every wall he'd built around his broken heart. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Sullivan had chosen his isolation carefully. The cabin sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Falls, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during Montana's harsh winters. It was exactly what he'd wanted after losing everything that mattered, a place where no one could find him, where no well-meaning friends could offer hollow condolences, where the silence could finally drown out the echoes of laughter that once filled his life. The storm that began on Tuesday had escalated into something biblical. By Friday evening, wind howled through the pine forests with a ferocity that made the massive logs of his cabin groan in protest. Rain hammered the metal roof in sheets so thick that visibility beyond the covered porch had vanished entirely. Marcus had spent the day reinforcing shutters and checking the generator, but mostly he'd done what he'd done every day for 24 months. Tried to drink enough bourbon to make the nightmares stay away. At 42, Marcus had the weathered hands of a man who'd built his fortune through honest labor. His construction company had once employed over 100 people across 3 counties, specializing in custom homes for wealthy clients who appreciated quality craftsmanship. He'd been proud of the business he'd built from nothing, proud of the reputation for integrity that had taken 20 years to establish. But pride had become a luxury he could no longer afford after the accident. The pounding on his door came just after 9 o'clock, cutting through the storm's fury with desperate urgency. Marcus set down his glass with hands that had developed a slight tremor over the past 2 years, not from age, but from the constant battle between grief and guilt. That played out in his chest every waking moment. He approached the door cautiously. In 2 years of self-imposed exile, exactly 3 people had made the journey to his cabin. His lawyer settling final business matters, a persistent insurance investigator, and his brother Jake, who'd tried unsuccessfully to convince him to return to civilization. Each visit had ended with Marcus more determined to maintain his isolation. The pounding came again, weaker this time, almost pleading. Marcus unlatched the heavy door and pulled it open against the wind. What he saw defied every expectation his alcohol-numbed mind could have formed. A young woman collapsed against his doorframe, her long brown hair plastered to her face by the driving rain. Her clothes a thin denim jacket and jeans that offered no protection against the mountain storm were soaked through. But it wasn't the woman's desperate condition that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was the twin infants she clutched against her chest. 2 tiny babies, wrapped in what appeared to be hospital blankets that had provided little shelter from the storm. The woman's arms formed a protective shield around them. Her body curved in a way that suggested she'd used herself as their only defense against the elements. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My babies." Marcus stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to process the scene. Then training older than his grief kicked in the instincts of a man who'd spent decades solving problems and protecting people under his care. He stepped forward and carefully lifted the woman, babies and all, carrying them into the warmth of his cabin. She was lighter than seemed possible for someone who'd just given birth, her body trembling with exhaustion and hypothermia. The babies, he could see now they were newborns, probably only days old, were eerily quiet, their tiny faces blue-tinged in a way that made his heart race with alarm. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered. kicking the door closed and carrying his unexpected guests toward the stone fireplace, where flames crackled with welcoming heat. "What the hell were you doing out in this storm?" The woman tried to respond, but her words came out as incoherent mumbles. Her lips had taken on a bluish color that Marcus recognized as severe hypothermia. Whatever had driven her to his door through 15 miles of mountain wilderness during a violent storm, she'd nearly died in the attempt. Marcus laid her gently on the leather sofa closest to the fire, then immediately focused on the twins. His hands, steady despite the bourbon, carefully unwrapped the hospital blankets. Both babies were girls, identical in their tiny perfection, but their skin had the waxy pallor that indicated dangerous cold exposure. For a moment, Marcus felt the familiar paralysis that had defined his existence for 2 years. The sight of helpless children triggered memories he'd spent every waking hour trying to suppress: other children, other emergencies, other desperate attempts to save lives that had ended in devastating failure. But these babies were alive. Their chests rose and fell with rapid, shallow breaths. Their tiny fists moved weakly as he examined them. Unlike the memories that haunted his nightmares, this crisis was happening now, and he still had the power to act. Marcus had never been a father. That dream had died with everything else 2 years ago, but he'd grown up in a family of 6 children. He'd helped his mother care for younger siblings, changed diapers, given bottles, walked crying babies through long nights. The knowledge felt rusty, but first priority, warming without shocking their systems. He grabbed thick wool blankets from his bedroom and created a nest near the fireplace, then carefully moved both twins into the warm cocoon. Their breathing seemed to ease slightly as heat began to penetrate their tiny bodies. Second priority, the mother. The young woman lay unconscious on his sofa, her wet clothes creating a puddle on the leather. Marcus knew he needed to get her out of the soaked garments, but hesitated, aware of the implications and his own complicated history with women in distress. 2 years ago, his hesitation in a crisis had cost lives. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Working with clinical efficiency, Marcus removed the woman's wet jacket and shoes, then covered her with dry blankets. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her skin temperature felt slightly warmer than when he'd first touched her. The fire's heat was helping, but she needed more intensive warming. Marcus retrieved hot water bottles from his emergency supplies. The isolation had taught him to prepare for medical emergencies and placed them carefully around her body. He elevated her feet and monitored her pulse, which was weak but regular. Only then did he allow himself to really look at his unexpected guests. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with delicate features that spoke of someone who'd been beautiful before exhaustion and exposure had taken their toll. Her hands bore the soft calluses of someone who worked, but not in heavy labor. Even unconscious, her arms remained positioned protectively, as if her body couldn't forget its primary mission of shielding the twins. The babies themselves were remarkably similar, identical twins with wisps of dark hair and the tiny, perfect features of the very newly born. Hospital bracelets still circled their impossibly small wrists. Though Marcus couldn't read the information in the dim light, questions multiplied in his mind as he sat vigil beside the fire. Who was this woman? How had she ended up in his isolated cabin during the worst storm of the season? Where was the father of these children? And most urgently, what kind of desperation would drive someone to attempt a 15-mile journey through wilderness with newborn twins? The wind continued to howl outside, rattling windows and sending occasional puffs of smoke back down the chimney. The power had gone out around 8 o'clock, leaving only the fire and a few battery-powered lanterns for illumination. In the dancing shadows, Marcus found himself studying the peaceful faces of the sleeping twins. Something stirred in his chest, an emotion he'd thought permanently buried under layers of guilt and self-imposed isolation. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Sullivan was responsible for someone other than himself. The weight of that responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely familiar. Around midnight, the woman's eyes fluttered open. "My babies," were her first words, spoken with desperate urgency as she tried to sit up. "They're safe," Marcus said quietly, moving closer so she could see the twins sleeping peacefully in their warm nest. "They're right here." The relief that crossed her face was so profound that Marcus felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. She reached toward the babies with trembling hands, and he helped her sit up enough to touch each tiny face. "Thank you," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought ... when I couldn't find help in town. I saw your light from the road and—" Her words trailed off as exhaustion overwhelmed her again, but Marcus had heard enough to understand that she'd been seeking help in Cedar Falls before somehow ending up at his cabin. The town was 15 miles away, and the road between here and there was treacherous even in good weather. "What's your name?" Marcus asked gently. "Sarah," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah Chun. These are Emma and Grace." Marcus felt something shift in his chest at the sound of names being attached to his unexpected guests. They were no longer anonymous strangers seeking shelter, but specific people with specific identities who'd somehow become his responsibility. "I'm Marcus," he replied. "Marcus Sullivan. You're safe here, Sarah, all of you." As if responding to their mother's voice, both twins began to stir. The soft mewling sounds they made sent an unexpected jolt through Marcus's system, a combination of protectiveness and something deeper that he wasn't ready to examine. "They need to eat," Sarah said, attempting to sit up fully. "It's been ... I don't know how long." Marcus helped her adjust her position, then discreetly turned away while she attended to the baby's immediate needs. The sounds of a mother caring for her children filled the cabin. Soft murmurs, gentle movements, the quiet satisfaction of infants finding comfort. For 24 months, Marcus Sullivan had lived in a world defined by silence and isolation. He'd chosen emptiness because it felt safer than risking additional loss. But now, in the space of a few hours, his carefully constructed solitude had been invaded by the most fundamental sounds of life itself. As the storm continued to rage outside, Marcus found himself watching over this unexpected family with growing awareness that everything had just changed. The woman and her twins represented exactly the kind of vulnerability he'd spent 2 years avoiding. People who could be hurt, people who needed protection, people whose loss could destroy whatever remained of his soul, but they were here now in his cabin, under his protection. And for the first time since the accident that had shattered his life, Marcus Sullivan found himself caring whether someone lived or died. The bourbon sat forgotten on the side table as he maintained his vigil through the long night, watching over 3 lives that had literally collapsed into his world during the worst storm anyone could remember. By dawn, he would discover that Sarah Chun and her twins carried secrets that would challenge everything he thought he knew about redemption, responsibility, and the possibility of healing hearts that seemed irreparably broken. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm finally broke just before sunrise, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt almost unnatural after 3 days of nature's fury. Marcus had dozed fitfully in his armchair, jerking awake every time one of the twins stirred or Sarah shifted on the sofa. The responsibility of protecting 3 vulnerable lives had triggered a hypervigilance he hadn't experienced since his days running construction sites, where a moment's inattention could prove fatal. As golden light filtered through the cabin's windows, Marcus got his first clear look at his unexpected guests. Sarah Chun appeared even younger in daylight, perhaps 24 or 25, with the kind of refined features that suggested education and privilege, rather than the hardscrabble background he'd initially assumed. Her hands, which he now examined more carefully as she held her daughters, bore no calluses from manual labor, but showed the ink stains and precise movements of someone who worked with documents or detailed paperwork. The twins, Emma and Grace, were remarkably healthy looking, despite their ordeal. As Sarah fed them in the morning light, Marcus could see they were probably no more than 4 or 5 days old, still bearing the slightly wrinkled appearance of the very newly born. Their hospital bracelets, now clearly visible, bore yesterday's date from Mercy General Hospital in Billings, nearly 200 miles away. "Billings," Marcus said quietly, noting Sarah's surprised expression as she realized he'd seen the bracelets. "That's a long way from here. How did you end up in Cedar Falls?" Sarah's composure, which had seemed fragile but intact throughout the night, began to crack. Her hands trembled as she adjusted Grace's blanket, and tears started forming in her eyes. "I ran," she whispered. "I had to run." Marcus felt his protective instinct sharpen. In his construction business, he'd encountered enough domestic violence situations among his workers to recognize the signs, the fear, the isolation, the desperate flight with inadequate resources. But something about Sarah's situation felt more complex than a simple abusive relationship. "From who?" Marcus asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. "The baby's father?" "From my father," Sarah replied, the words emerging as if she were confessing a crime. "And my husband. And people who think they own my children because of who I married." The story that emerged over the next hour painted a picture of privilege transformed into prison. Sarah Chun had been raised in wealth as the daughter of Dr. Richard Chun, a prominent surgeon in Billings whose social ambitions exceeded even his considerable medical skills. At 22, she'd been pressured into marrying Bradley Morrison III, heir to Morrison Industries, one of Montana's largest agricultural equipment manufacturers. "It was supposed to be perfect," Sarah explained, her voice hollow with exhaustion and disillusionment. 2 prominent families joining forces. Bradley was handsome, educated, came from the right background. My father saw it as the culmination of everything he'd worked to achieve in America. But the marriage had been a facade from the beginning. Bradley Morrison III was an alcoholic with violent tendencies that his family's wealth had successfully concealed. Worse, he'd made it clear that children were expected not as expressions of love, but as heirs to continue the Morrison legacy under his absolute control. "When I got pregnant, everything changed," Sarah continued, absently stroking Emma's tiny hand. "Bradley started talking about his sons and how they'd be raised to take over the business. He hired nannies before the babies were even born, enrolled them in exclusive schools, planned every detail of their lives without asking my opinion about anything." Marcus felt anger building in his chest, not the explosive rage that had consumed him after his own tragedy, but the cold, controlled fury of someone witnessing systematic injustice. He'd grown up poor but surrounded by love, where children were treasured rather than treated as investments. "When I found out I was having girls instead of boys, Bradley ... Sarah's voice broke completely. "He said they were worthless. That daughters couldn't carry on the Morrison name or run the business. He started talking about trying again immediately, about how these babies were just practice rounds until I gave him proper heirs." The casual cruelty of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked at the sleeping twins, Emma and Grace, perfect in their innocence, and couldn't comprehend how anyone could view them as anything other than miraculous gifts. "So you left," Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I planned to leave after they were born, when I'd recovered enough to travel safely," Sarah replied. "But then my father got involved. He and Bradley made arrangements without telling me. Legal documents giving Bradley complete custody rights, medical decisions, everything. They were going to take my daughters away from me the moment I was discharged from the hospital." Marcus's construction background had taught him to recognize when structural supports were failing, when the foundation of something supposedly solid was actually rotten. Sarah's story revealed a family structure built on control rather than love, where women and children existed as assets to be managed rather than people to be cherished. How did you get away? My nurse at the hospital, Sarah said with the first genuine smile Marcus had seen cross her face. Maria Santos. She'd been watching what was happening, listening to the conversations between my father and Bradley. When she overheard them discussing the custody transfer, she helped me discharge myself early. Maria had apparently done more than just facilitate Sarah's escape. She'd provided cash, borrowed scrubs to disguise Sarah's departure, and given her the address of a women's shelter in Cedar Falls that specialized in helping victims of domestic abuse. But the shelter was full, Sarah continued. The storm had displaced families from a trailer park that flooded, and they didn't have space for someone with newborns. The volunteer at the desk gave me directions to other resources, but everything was so far away, and the storm was getting worse. Double quotes. Marcus could fill in the rest. Sarah had attempted to drive toward alternative shelters, but had been forced to take shelter when the storm became too dangerous. She'd seen the lights from his cabin and made a desperate choice to seek help from a stranger, rather than risk her daughter's lives in the increasingly violent weather. Do they know where you are? Marcus asked, already knowing this question would determine everything that happened next. I don't think so, Sarah replied uncertainly. I paid cash for everything, didn't use my credit cards or phone. But Bradley has resources, private investigators, connections with law enforcement. If he's determined to find us. Marcus understood the implications. Bradley Morrison III wasn't just a wealthy individual with hurt feelings. He was part of a family that wielded significant political and economic influence across Montana. If he wanted to locate his missing wife and daughters, he had the resources to make that happen efficiently. More troubling was the legal dimension of Sarah's situation. Regardless of the moral justification for her flight, she'd technically kidnapped her own children by removing them from the hospital against her husband's wishes. Montana's custody laws heavily favored fathers in wealthy families, especially when those fathers had connections to judges and prosecutors. What's your plan? Marcus asked, though he suspected Sarah hadn't been able to think beyond immediate survival. I don't have one, she admitted. I just knew I couldn't let them take my daughters. Everything else. I thought I'd figure it out once we were safe. Marcus studied Sarah's face in the morning light, noting the determination beneath the exhaustion. Despite her privileged background, she'd shown remarkable courage in choosing her children's welfare over her own security. She'd given up wealth, family connections, and social status to protect twin daughters from a father who viewed them as disappointments. But courage without resources was often insufficient, especially when facing opponents with unlimited money and institutional power. Sarah and her daughters needed more than temporary shelter. They needed a strategy for building new lives beyond the reach of people who considered them property. There's something you should know about me, Marcus said. Carefully. Something that might affect whether you want to stay here or find help elsewhere. Sarah's expression grew wary, probably wondering what dark secret her rescuer was about to reveal. 2 years ago, I was married. My wife Jennifer was pregnant with our first child, a daughter we'd planned to name Rebecca. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest as he spoke these words aloud for the first time in months. Jennifer was driving to her doctor's appointment when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car. Sarah's face softened with understanding and sympathy, but Marcus forced himself to continue. Both Jennifer and Rebecca died instantly. The drunk driver was a kid 19 years old, coming off a 3-day bender. His father was a judge in Billings County. The boy got 6 months in minimum security and was released after 4 for good behavior. The parallel to Sarah's situation was obvious. Wealth and connections had protected someone who destroyed Marcus's family, just as they were now being used to threaten Sarah's freedom to protect her children. I'm telling you this because I spent 2 years hiding from anything that reminded me of what I'd lost. I chose isolation over the risk of caring about someone else who could be taken away." Marcus looked directly at Sarah, then at the sleeping twins. "But I can't stand by and watch while powerful people try to steal children from someone who loves them." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing both Marcus's tragedy and his implied offer of help. "You don't owe us anything," she said finally. "You saved our lives last night. That's already more than ... "It's not about owing," Marcus interrupted. "It's about what's right." Outside, the storm's aftermath revealed a landscape transformed by 3 days of intensive rain and wind. Fallen trees blocked the road to town, power lines lay scattered across the forest, and the normally gentle creek that ran past Marcus's property had swollen into a rushing torrent. Even if Sarah wanted to leave immediately, the physical damage from the storm would keep them isolated for at least several more days. "The road's impassable," Marcus observed, studying the scene through his kitchen window. "Could be a week before crews can clear all the debris." Rather than seeming frustrated by this news, Sarah appeared almost relieved. The forced delay would give her time to recover physically from childbirth and develop a more comprehensive plan for her daughter's future. "I need to call the hospital," she said suddenly. "Maria Santos, the nurse who helped me. I promised to let her know we were safe." Marcus handed her his landline phone, noting that cellular service was non-existent this far from town even under normal circumstances. Sarah dialed the number with hands that had stopped trembling for the first time since her arrival. The conversation with Maria Santos revealed additional complications that would shape their immediate future. Bradley Morrison had indeed discovered Sarah's disappearance and had mobilized significant resources to locate her. Private investigators were canvassing hospitals, shelters, and hotels across 3 states. More ominously, he'd hired a high-powered law firm to pursue kidnapping charges against Sarah if she didn't return voluntarily with the twins. "But Maria also said something encouraging," Sarah reported after ending the call. "There's a network of people who help women in situations like mine. People who understand how to navigate legal systems when money and power are being used as weapons." Marcus felt something shifting in his perspective as he absorbed this information. For 2 years, he'd viewed himself as someone who'd lost the ability to protect the people he cared about. But Sarah and her daughters represented a chance to prevent tragedy rather than simply mourning it after the fact. "Tell me about this network," he said, settling into planning mode for the first time since Jennifer's death. That, as Sarah described, the underground railroad of social workers, lawyers, and safe houses that helped women escape abusive situations. Marcus found himself calculating resources, analyzing challenges, and developing strategies. His construction background had taught him to break complex projects into manageable phases, and protecting Sarah's family would require the same systematic approach. The twins woke simultaneously as if responding to the shift in energy around them. Emma began fussing first, quickly followed by Grace, their tiny voices filling the cabin with sounds that Marcus was beginning to find comforting rather than overwhelming. As Sarah tended to her daughters, Marcus watched the easy grace with which she handled 2 demanding infants simultaneously. Despite her youth and circumstances, she possessed an instinctive competence that spoke of genuine maternal devotion rather than obligation. "They're beautiful," Marcus said, the words emerging before he could censor them. Sarah looked up with surprise, as if she'd expected judgment rather than admiration. "They're everything to me," she replied simply. "Whatever it costs to keep them safe, whatever I have to give up or risk, it's worth it." Marcus recognized the absolute conviction in her voice, the same commitment he'd felt toward Jennifer and their unborn daughter, the same dedication that had made their loss so devastating, but also so meaningful. As the morning progressed and the full scope of Sarah's situation became clear, Marcus realized he was facing a choice that would determine the direction of his own life as much as theirs. He could provide temporary shelter and resources, help Sarah connect with a network of people who specialized in these situations, then return to his careful isolation once they'd moved on to safety. Or he could acknowledge what was already becoming obvious, that these three unexpected guests had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried. Something that made the prospect of returning to solitude feel like a form of death rather than safety. The twins fell asleep again in the warm nest of blankets beside the fireplace, their perfect faces peaceful in the golden morning light. Sarah dozed fitfully on the sofa, exhaustion finally overcoming the hypervigilance that had sustained her through her desperate flight. Marcus sat watching over all three of them, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders. But this time, instead of feeling crushed by the possibility of failure, he found himself energized by the chance to get it right. Whatever came next would require careful planning, considerable resources, and willingness to risk everything he'd built in his isolated retreat. But as he watched Emma and Grace sleep peacefully in his cabin, Marcus Sullivan began to understand that some responsibilities were worth accepting regardless of the personal cost. The question was no longer whether he would help Sarah protect her daughters. The question was how far he would go to ensure they had the chance to grow up free from the people who viewed them as property rather than precious gifts deserving of love and protection. 3 days after the storm cleared, Marcus's landline rang at exactly 6 a.m. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Martinez, a social worker from Helena who'd gotten his number through Maria Santos at the hospital. Her voice carried the professional calm of someone accustomed to crisis situations, but Marcus detected an underlying urgency that made him instantly alert. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand you're currently providing shelter for Sarah Chun and her daughters," Rebecca said without preamble. "We need to meet today." Marcus glanced toward the bedroom where Sarah was finally getting uninterrupted sleep after 3 nights of feeding twins every 2 hours. The babies had settled into a routine that allowed for longer stretches of rest, but Sarah's physical recovery from childbirth was being complicated by the stress of living as a fugitive. "What kind of meeting?" Marcus asked, instinctively protective of the fragile piece his cabin had become. "The kind that might save her life," Rebecca replied bluntly. "Bradley Morrison hired Blackwater Investigations yesterday. They specialize in tracking missing persons, and they have a 96% success rate in cases involving family abductions." Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Blackwater Investigations was notorious throughout Montana for their aggressive tactics and willingness to operate in legal gray areas. If Bradley Morrison had escalated to hiring professional trackers, Sarah's window of safety was rapidly closing. "Where do you want to meet?" "There's an old mining camp about 12 miles north of your location. Ghost town called Silver Creek. Meet me at the main shaft building at noon. Come alone." After Rebecca Martinez ended the call, Marcus stood staring at the phone for several minutes. The protective isolation he'd maintained for 2 years was dissolving rapidly as Sarah's crisis drew him deeper into networks he'd never known existed. But retreat was no longer an option, not with 2 tiny lives depending on his protection. Sarah emerged from the bedroom as Marcus was preparing to leave, holding Emma while Grace continued sleeping. The past few days had restored some color to her cheeks, but dark circles under her eyes revealed the constant stress she was carrying. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting his serious expression. Marcus explained about Rebecca Martinez and the meeting at Silver Creek, watching Sarah's face pale as he mentioned Blackwater Investigations. "I've heard of them," Sarah said quietly. "Bradley's father used them during a business dispute 2 years ago. They found information that destroyed the opposing company's executives, personal details, financial records, family vulnerabilities. They don't just locate people, Marcus. They gather ammunition." The implication was clear. If Blackwater was involved, This had escalated beyond a simple custody dispute into a campaign designed to systematically dismantle Sarah's ability to resist or hide. "I want to come with you," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's blanket with hands that had started trembling again. "Absolutely not," Marcus replied firmly. "You're barely recovered from childbirth. The babies need consistency, and we don't know if this meeting is secure." Sarah's jaw set in a stubborn line that Marcus was beginning to recognize. Despite her privileged background, she possessed a core of steel that revealed itself when her children were threatened. "These are my daughters, Marcus. My decisions to make, and my cabin providing the shelter," Marcus countered. "My risk assessment, my rules." The argument that followed revealed the underlying tension that had been building since Sarah's arrival. She was grateful for Marcus's protection, but struggled with the loss of control that came with depending on someone else's resources and judgment. Marcus, meanwhile, was discovering that caring about vulnerable people again meant accepting responsibility for decisions that could prove fatal if made incorrectly. The conflict was resolved when Emma began crying, quickly followed by Grace. Sarah's maternal instincts overrode her desire to maintain control, and she reluctantly agreed to remain at the cabin while Marcus attended the meeting alone. "But I want to know everything," she insisted as she prepared bottles for the twins. "Every detail, every option, every risk. These people are talking about my daughter's future, and I won't be excluded from decisions that affect them." Marcus understood her position completely. His own sense of helplessness after Jennifer's death had been exacerbated by lawyers and insurance investigators making decisions about his life without consulting his preferences or emotional needs. "You'll know everything," he promised. "But, Sarah, if this meeting reveals that staying here puts you and the babies at risk, we need to be prepared to move quickly." The drive to Silver Creek took Marcus through terrain that still bore scars from the recent storm. Fallen trees had been pushed aside to create a single lane of passage, and temporary bridges spanned areas where culverts had been washed out. The isolation that had once protected his grief was now serving a different purpose, providing natural barriers against people who might be tracking Sarah's movements. Silver Creek had been abandoned since the copper boom ended in the 1960s, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and rusted mining equipment that testified to dreams of wealth that had never materialized. The main shaft building sat at the center of the ghost town, its corrugated metal roof partially collapsed, but its stone foundation still solid. Rebecca Martinez was waiting inside the building when Marcus arrived. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with the practical clothing and alert demeanor of someone who spent considerable time in challenging situations. Her handshake was firm, her eye contact direct, and her assessment of Marcus obviously thorough and professional. "Thank you for coming," she said, indicating a makeshift table created from mining equipment where she'd spread several folders and documents. "Before we begin, I need to verify that you understand the legal risks you're assuming by harboring Sarah and her children." Marcus had been anticipating this conversation. By providing shelter to someone who'd technically violated custody agreements, he was potentially exposing himself to charges of aiding and abetting kidnapping. His construction business, his property, his freedom, all could be jeopardized if prosecutors decided to make an example of him. "I understand the risks," Marcus replied. "Tell me about the network." Rebecca smiled with approval at his directness. "We call it the Underground Railroad for the digital age. Social workers, lawyers, safe house operators, and private citizens who help women and children escape domestic violence situations that traditional systems can't or won't address." She opened the first folder, revealing photographs and case files that illustrated the network's scope. Marcus saw documentation of dozens of successful relocations, legal victories that had seemed impossible, and families who'd found safety after being failed by conventional resources. "Sarah's case is unusual because of the Morrison family's influence," Rebecca continued. Most abusers don't have the resources to hire firms like Blackwater or influence prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions. But that also means Sarah needs protection strategies that go beyond our standard protocols. The second folder contained intelligence about Bradley Morrison III that painted a disturbing picture of escalating desperation and rage. Since Sarah's disappearance, he'd made increasingly threatening statements to hospital staff, hired private investigators in 3 states, and begun pressuring judges who owed political favors to his family. More concerning, Rebecca said, producing a third folder, is what we've learned about his father's involvement. Bradley Morrison Jr. sees this as a direct challenge to the family's reputation and control. He's treating Sarah's flight as a form of corporate rebellion that needs to be crushed publicly to discourage others. Marcus studied photographs of both Morrison men Bradley III with his soft features and entitled expression, and his father whose cold eyes suggested someone accustomed to eliminating obstacles through whatever means necessary. What are Sarah's legal options? Limited, Rebecca admitted. Montana's custody laws favor fathers, especially wealthy ones with established local ties. Sarah signed prenuptial agreements that essentially give Bradley control over any children from the marriage. Her best chance is to establish residency in a different state with more progressive family courts. This was where the network's true value became apparent. Rebecca outlined a careful strategy for relocating Sarah and the twins to Oregon, where domestic violence laws provided stronger protections for mothers fleeing abusive situations. But the transition has to be perfect, Rebecca emphasized. Any mistakes using credit cards, making phone calls, visiting familiar places, and Blackwater will triangulate her location within hours. Marcus studied the relocation plan with his project manager's eye for detail. The logistics were complex but manageable, requiring coordination between safe houses in 3 states and timing that would minimize exposure during the most vulnerable travel periods. What do you need from me? He asked. Your cabin provides ideal temporary security while we finalize arrangements, Rebecca replied. But more importantly, we need someone with local knowledge and resources who can serve as Sarah's advocate throughout the process. Marcus understood what she was really asking. The network could provide legal expertise, safe transportation, and new identities, but Sarah needed someone personally committed to her welfare who could make quick decisions when circumstances changed unexpectedly. There's something else, Rebecca said, her expression growing more serious. We've identified a potential complication that could affect everyone involved in helping Sarah. She produced a final folder containing surveillance photographs that made Marcus's blood run cold. The images showed his cabin, taken from multiple angles with telephoto lenses that captured clear details of the property and its approaches. These were taken yesterday, Rebecca explained. Source unknown, but the quality suggests professional equipment and expertise. Marcus stared at the photographs, feeling the familiar sensation of walls closing in that had defined his life after Jennifer's death. Despite his precautions and the storm damage that had isolated the cabin, someone had located Sarah and was already conducting surveillance. How long do we have? He asked, his mind already shifting into crisis management mode. Unknown. The surveillance could be preliminary reconnaissance for an immediate extraction, or it could be evidence gathering for a legal strategy. Either way, Sarah and the babies can't remain at your cabin much longer. Rebecca outlined contingency plans for emergency evacuation, but Marcus barely heard the details. His thoughts were focused on Sarah sleeping peacefully in his cabin, finally, feeling safe enough to rest while unknown observers cataloged her location and activities. I need to get back, Marcus said, standing abruptly. If they're watching the cabin... They're watching, Rebecca confirmed. But they're also waiting for something. Probably legal authorization for retrieval or confirmation that Sarah won't surrender voluntarily. Marcus drove back toward his cabin with hyper-awareness of every vehicle on the road every movement in his peripheral vision. The isolation that had once provided comfort now felt like a trap, with limited escape routes and no nearby assistance if the situation escalated. But as he approached his property and saw no obvious signs of surveillance teams, Marcus realized that fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Sarah and her daughters were depending on his protection, and that responsibility overrode any concerns about personal risk. Inside the cabin, he found Sarah sitting beside the fireplace with both twins, sleeping in her arms. The peaceful scene was so at odds with the surveillance photographs that Marcus felt a surge of protective rage toward anyone who would threaten such innocent vulnerability. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, studying his expression for clues about their situation. Marcus sat across from her and methodically outlined everything Rebecca Martinez had revealed: the network's capabilities, the relocation plan to Oregon, and the disturbing evidence that their location had been compromised. Sarah listened without interruption, her face growing pale as the full scope of their danger became clear. When Marcus finished explaining about the surveillance photographs, she looked down at her sleeping daughters with an expression that combined fierce protectiveness with devastating fear. "How much time do we have to decide?" she asked quietly. "Not long," Marcus replied honestly. "Rebecca thinks we have maybe 48 hours before whatever's being planned gets activated." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, absently stroking Emma's tiny hand while processing the impossible choice between staying in the safety of Marcus's cabin and embarking on a dangerous journey toward an uncertain future. "I need to tell you something," she said finally. "Something that might change whether you're willing to help us." Marcus waited, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to reveal a crucial secret. "Bradley didn't just marry me for family connections," Sarah continued. "My father has been laundering money through his medical practice for several Morrison Industries subsidiaries. The marriage was partly about legitimizing questionable business relationships through family ties." The revelation added another layer of complexity to Sarah's situation. She wasn't just a wife seeking freedom from an abusive husband, she was a potential witness to financial crimes that could expose powerful people to serious criminal charges. "That's why Bradley's father is so determined to bring me back," Sarah explained. "It's not just about family pride or controlling the twins. I have access to information that could destroy both families if it reached the wrong people." Marcus absorbed this information with growing understanding of why the Morrison family was treating Sarah's disappearance as a crisis requiring extreme measures. Her knowledge made her simultaneously valuable and dangerous, too important to lose, too risky to allow complete freedom. "Does Rebecca Martinez know about this?" Marcus asked. "Not yet. I wasn't sure who to trust with that information." Marcus studied Sarah's face, recognizing the additional burden she'd been carrying. She wasn't just protecting her daughters from an abusive father. She was potentially holding evidence that could bring down a criminal conspiracy involving some of Montana's most influential families. "We need to tell Rebecca," Marcus said decisively. "This changes everything about how to handle your case." As evening approached and the twins woke for their feeding schedule, Marcus found himself contemplating a choice that would define not just the immediate future, but the kind of person he wanted to be in the years ahead. 2 years ago, he'd chosen isolation over the risk of additional loss. But watching Sarah care for her daughters with such dedicated love, seeing the trust in her eyes when she looked at him for protection, Marcus realized that some risks were worth taking, regardless of the potential cost. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could save or destroy multiple lives. Tonight, he would stand guard over 3 people who had become more precious to him than his own safety, knowing that whatever came next would require every skill he'd learned in 42 years of solving problems and protecting the people under his care. The surveillance photographs lay on his kitchen table like a countdown timer. But Marcus Sullivan was no longer the broken man who'd fled to this cabin, seeking escape from responsibility. He was someone, with something worth fighting for again. That made all the difference in the world. The black SUVs arrived at dawn on the 5th day, moving up Marcus's access road with the precision of a military operation. He spotted them through his bedroom window while checking on the twins, who had finally begun sleeping through the night in the makeshift nursery he'd created using furniture from his workshop. 3 vehicles, tinted windows, license plates from different states. Professional surveillance teams didn't announce themselves so obviously unless they wanted to be seen. This was psychological warfare, a demonstration of power designed to force mistakes through intimidation. Marcus woke Sarah. With a gentle touch on her shoulder, his finger pressed to his lips in a gesture for silence. She came instantly awake with the hypervigilance of new motherhood, her eyes immediately moving to Emma and Grace, sleeping peacefully in their converted dresser drawers. "Company," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the window. Sarah's face went white as she observed the vehicles positioning themselves to block all escape routes from the cabin. The tactical precision of their deployment suggested military or law enforcement training, which meant Bradley Morrison had escalated beyond private investigators to something far more dangerous. "Take the babies to the root cellar," Marcus instructed. Quietly, his mind shifting into the crisis management mode that had served him through 20 years of construction emergencies. "There's a hidden entrance behind the water heater in the basement. Food, water, blankets, everything you need for at least 12 hours. The root cellar was a Cold War-era addition to the cabin, built by a previous owner who'd been convinced nuclear war was imminent. Marcus had maintained it as emergency storage, never imagining it would serve as a sanctuary for newborns and their fugitive mother. "What about you?" Sarah asked, already moving to gather the twins and their supplies. "I'm going to find out what they want and buy you time to get settled," Marcus replied, checking his hunting rifle to ensure it was loaded. "If shooting starts, stay hidden no matter what you hear. Rebecca Martinez knows about this location, Send help if I don't check in by tonight." Sarah paused in gathering baby supplies, looking at Marcus with an expression that combined gratitude, fear, and something deeper that neither of them had yet acknowledged aloud. "Marcus, I need you to." "No." "Save it," he interrupted gently. "We'll have time for conversations after we get through this." As Sarah disappeared into the basement with Emma and Grace, Marcus took a position by the front window where he could observe the vehicles while remaining concealed. His construction experience had taught him to read situations quickly and identify the real decision-makers in any group, skills that proved invaluable as he watched the surveillance teams organize themselves. The lead vehicle disgorged 4 men in tactical gear who moved with the fluid coordination of professional operators. Not law enforcement, their equipment was too expensive and their coordination too polished for any agency that operated within legal constraints. These were military contractors or private security specialists, the kind of people wealthy families hired when they needed problems eliminated rather than solved. A second team emerged from the middle SUV, these individuals dressed in business suits and carrying briefcases that suggested legal rather than tactical authority. The combination of force and documentation indicated this wasn't a simple kidnapping attempt. It was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to appear legitimate even while violating multiple laws. The third vehicle remained sealed, its occupants invisible behind tinted glass. But Marcus could see the silhouette of at least one person inside, presumably someone important enough to observe the operation personally rather than delegating it entirely to subordinates. Marcus's landline rang. At exactly 7:30 a.m., the sound cutting through the tense silence like a gunshot. He answered on the second ring, knowing that delay would be interpreted as weakness or fear. "Mr. Sullivan." The voice was professionally polite with undertones of absolute authority. "My name is David Blackwood, senior partner at Blackwater Investigations. I believe you have something that belongs to my client." "I believe you're trespassing on private property," Marcus replied calmly. "Montana law gives me considerable latitude in dealing with uninvited visitors." Blackwood's laugh was genuinely amused. "Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate your spirit, but let's discuss the situation realistically. We have documentation authorizing the recovery of Sarah Chun Morrison and her minor children. We have legal authority to search any premises where they might be located. And we have the resources to make this process either cooperative or extremely unpleasant." Through the window, Marcus watched one of the tactical team members producing what appeared to be electronic surveillance equipment. They were preparing to conduct a thorough search regardless of his cooperation, using technology that would locate any hiding places within the cabin. "What kind of documentation?" Marcus asked, buying time while mentally calculating defensive options. "Emergency custody orders issued by Judge Harrison Morrison Bradley's uncle in Billings County," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Temporary restraining orders against Sarah for kidnapping and child endangerment, and a civil warrant authorizing citizen's arrest for anyone providing material assistance to a fugitive." The legal framework was impressive in its comprehensiveness and completely bogus in its constitutional authority. No county judge could issue orders that superseded federal kidnapping laws or authorized private citizens to conduct armed searches across state lines. But the Morrison family clearly counted on most people being too intimidated to challenge questionable paperwork backed by overwhelming force. "I'll need to see those documents," Marcus said, knowing he was stalling but needing every additional minute to ensure Sarah and the twins remained hidden. "Of course. My associates will be happy to present them when you open your door and submit to a reasonable search of the premises." Marcus ended the call without responding, understanding that negotiation was impossible when one side held all the cards and felt no obligation to operate within legal constraints. The Morrison family had decided to resolve this situation through intimidation and force, counting on their wealth and connections to provide immunity from consequences. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. Marcus Sullivan was no longer the broken man who'd retreated to this cabin, seeking escape from responsibility. The past week of protecting Sarah and her daughters had awakened something that grief had buried, but not destroyed: the fierce determination that had built his construction business from nothing and sustained him through 20 years of challenges. Moreover, his 2 years of isolation had been spent not just drinking and mourning, but also preparing for scenarios where his remote location might require self-defense. The cabin was better fortified than it appeared, with reinforced doors, bulletproof glass in critical windows, and defensive positions that provided tactical advantages against multiple attackers. Most importantly, Marcus understood that surrender would not protect Sarah and the twins. It would simply transfer them from his protection to people who viewed them as property to be controlled, rather than lives to be cherished. At a.m., the tactical team began advancing toward the cabin with equipment designed for forced entry. Marcus counted 6 men total, all carrying weapons that suggested military training and access to sophisticated gear. Against ordinary resistance, they would have overwhelming advantages, but Marcus had spent 2 years learning every inch of his property, installing security measures that reflected both paranoia and practical preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. The first tactical operator to approach the cabin triggered a motion sensor that activated spotlights powerful enough to temporarily blind anyone wearing night vision equipment. The second stepped on a concealed pressure plate that released a cloud of pepper spray designed to disorient and disable anyone not wearing proper protection. Marcus had never intended these defenses for use against professional operators, but they bought precious seconds of confusion that allowed him to establish firing positions without immediately exposing himself to return fire. "Mr. Sullivan," Blackwood's voice came through a megaphone from behind the vehicles, "you're only making this more difficult for everyone involved. We know Sarah Chun is inside your cabin. Surrender her now, and we can resolve this situation without anyone getting hurt. Instead of responding verbally, Marcus triggered the next layer of defensive measures he'd installed over the past 2 years. Smoke grenades concealed around the cabin's perimeter created a dense cloud that obscured visibility while activating sprinkler systems designed to make tactical movement more difficult. The professional operators adjusted quickly to these obstacles, but their advance slowed significantly as they were forced to navigate defensive measures they hadn't anticipated. Marcus used their momentary confusion to establish communication with the hidden root cellar through an intercom system he'd installed for exactly this purpose. "Sarah, can you hear me?" he whispered into the concealed microphone. "We're here." Her voice came back immediately. "The babies are quiet, and we have everything we need. What's happening up there?" 6 tactical operators, professional gear, moving to breach the cabin, Marcus reported. "I'm going to delay them as long as possible, but if they get inside... "I understand," Sarah interrupted. "Do what you have to do, Marcus. We'll stay hidden." The determination in her voice reminded Marcus why this confrontation was worth the enormous risks he was taking. Sarah Chen Morrison had shown remarkable courage in choosing her daughter's welfare over her own security, and now it was his turn to demonstrate that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The tactical team's advance resumed with greater caution but continued professional competence. Marcus realized that his defensive measures would delay but not stop their entry into the cabin, which meant his only chance of protecting Sarah and the twins lay in controlling the narrative of what happened next. He activated the cabin's emergency communication system, a ham radio setup that could reach emergency services across 3 counties. If this confrontation was going to escalate into violence, Marcus wanted multiple witnesses to document who initiated the aggression and who was operating under legitimate authority. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Marcus Sullivan at coordinates 47.8396. North, 114.1786 West." He broadcast on the emergency frequency. "Armed intruders attempting forced entry of private residence under questionable legal authority. Request immediate law enforcement response and medical standby." The response was immediate and reassuring. Sheriff's deputies from 3 counties acknowledged his transmission and confirmed they were dispatching units to his location. More importantly, the broadcast would create an official record of events that would be difficult for the Morrison family to manipulate or conceal. Blackwood's voice came through the megaphone again, but this time Marcus detected anger beneath the professional composure. "Mr. Sullivan, you're interfering with a legal custody recovery authorized by proper court orders. Resistance will be met with appropriate force." Marcus keyed the ham radio again, ensuring his response would be recorded by multiple listeners across the region. "Negative, Blackwood. Show me federal authority for armed search of private property or remove your personnel from my land immediately." The tactical team had reached the cabin's front porch, but their advance stalled as they encountered reinforced doors and windows designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Marcus had invested heavily in security upgrades during his 2 years of isolation, creating defensive positions that would require explosive charges or heavy equipment to breach. But he also understood that his advantages were temporary. The Morrison family's resources included access to whatever equipment was necessary to overcome his defenses, and they clearly had no intention of accepting defeat simply because their initial approach had proven insufficient. The standoff continued for 27 minutes, with tactical operators probing for weaknesses while Marcus maintained defensive positions and broadcast regular updates to emergency frequencies. Then everything changed with the arrival of 2 additional vehicles that transformed the nature of the confrontation entirely. Sheriff's deputies from Glacier County arrived first, followed closely by Montana State Police units whose presence forced Blackwood's team to either produce legitimate authority for their actions or face Arrest for armed trespassing. Marcus watched through his reinforced windows as the tactical operators found themselves surrounded by genuine law enforcement, officers whose authority superseded any questionable paperwork the Morrison family might have obtained through political connections. The conversation between Sheriff Deputy Amanda Torres and David Blackwood was brief, professional, and devastating to the Morrison family strategy. Without federal authority or properly authenticated court orders, Blackwood's team had no legal standing to conduct armed searches or forced entries on private property. "Sir, you need to remove your personnel from this property immediately," Deputy Torres announced with the calm authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "If you have legitimate custody concerns, they need to be addressed through proper legal channels." Marcus keyed his ham radio one final time, ensuring his words would be recorded by multiple witnesses. "This is Marcus Sullivan. Sheriff's deputies have ordered the armed intruders to withdraw from my property. I am opening communications with law enforcement to discuss any legitimate concerns about persons who may have sought shelter at my location." The next hour involved careful negotiations between Marcus, Deputy Torres, and social workers who specialized in domestic violence cases. The conversation took place outside the cabin, with Sarah and the twins remaining safely hidden while Marcus provided selective information about his role in protecting a woman and children fleeing dangerous circumstances. Deputy Torres proved to be both professionally competent and personally sympathetic to Sarah's situation. Her questions focused on ensuring the safety and welfare of the children, rather than enforcing questionable custody orders issued through political favoritism. "Mr. Sullivan, if there are individuals at your location who need protection from domestic violence, there are proper procedures for ensuring their safety while addressing any legitimate legal concerns," she explained. "But those procedures don't involve armed civilians conducting military-style operations on private property." As Blackwood's team reluctantly withdrew their vehicles, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won this confrontation, but the Morrison family's resources remained essentially unlimited, and their determination to recover Sarah and the twins had clearly escalated beyond rational bounds. Deputy Torres remained behind to coordinate with Rebecca, Martinez, and the Domestic Violence Network, ensuring that Sarah's case would receive proper handling through legitimate legal channels rather than private justice, administered by wealthy families accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. When Marcus finally brought Sarah and the twins up from the root cellar, the relief on her face was overwhelming. Emma and Grace had slept through most of the confrontation, awakening only when the tactical vehicles withdrew and normal quiet returned to the cabin. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, holding both babies protectively as she surveyed the cabin for evidence of the morning's drama. "This round is over," Marcus replied honestly. "But they'll be back with better lawyers, more resources, and different strategies. We bought time, not victory." As evening approached and additional law enforcement vehicles arrived to ensure the property remained secure, Marcus realized that protecting Sarah and her daughters had evolved beyond providing temporary shelter. He was now committed to a long-term struggle against people who commanded vast resources and felt entitled to treat other human beings as property. But watching Sarah feed the twins beside his fireplace, seeing the trust in her eyes when she looked at him for guidance and protection, Marcus understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds or personal cost. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but sometimes that was exactly the transformation needed to discover what truly mattered in life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and different threats. But tonight Marcus Sullivan stood guard over 3 people who had become his family in every way that mattered, and that made him more dangerous to his enemies than they could possibly understand. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after the tactical team's failed assault on Marcus's cabin. Deputy Amanda Torres's voice carried the professional calm that cops used when delivering life-altering news. But Marcus detected an underlying tension that made him instantly alert. "Marcus, we have a problem. Rebecca Martinez is dead." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending ice through his veins. He looked toward the bedroom where Sarah was finally sleeping peacefully. The twins in their makeshift cribs beside the bed, all three blissfully unaware that their primary advocate in the underground network had just been eliminated. How? Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. Car accident on Highway 93 near Kalispell. Single vehicle, no witnesses, occurred around midnight. Initial investigation suggests she fell asleep at the wheel and hit a tree. Marcus had spent enough years managing construction sites to recognize when accidents were actually sabotage disguised as misfortune. Rebecca Martinez had been too experienced, too careful, and too aware of the dangers surrounding Sarah's case to simply fall asleep while driving on a familiar highway. "Let me guess," Marcus said grimly. "No skid marks, no evidence of mechanical failure, and a perfectly convenient location where a body could burn beyond forensic examination." Deputy Torres was quiet for several seconds before responding. "Marcus, I can't discuss details of an ongoing investigation, but I'm calling because Rebecca had listed you as an emergency contact in her files. More importantly, she documented concerns about escalating threats against people involved in the Sarah Chun case. The implications were clear. Rebecca's death served as both elimination of a key resource and a warning to anyone else considering interference with the Morrison family's objectives. Professional assassins had made it appear accidental, but the timing and circumstances sent an unmistakable message to Sarah's remaining supporters. "What about the rest of the network?" Marcus asked. "Going dark. 3 other social workers have received anonymous threats in the past 24 hours. The safe house in Oregon is temporarily closed due to security concerns. Everyone's scared. Marcus, Rebecca was the most experienced operator in this region, and if they could reach her..." Deputy Torres didn't need to finish the sentence. If the Morrison family could eliminate someone as careful and connected as Rebecca Martinez, no one in the underground network was truly safe from retaliation. Marcus ended the call and sat in the darkness of his living room, watching the dying embers in the fireplace while processing the full scope of what Rebecca's death meant for Sarah and the twins. Their primary escape route had been severed, their most experienced advocates silenced, and their remaining allies intimidated into withdrawal. Worse, the message was clearly intended for Marcus himself. He was no longer just providing temporary shelter, he had become the primary obstacle to the Morrison family's objectives, which made him a target for the same elimination tactics they'd used against Rebecca. When Sarah woke at dawn for the twins' feeding, Marcus was still sitting by the cold fireplace, studying maps and making calculations that might determine whether any of them survived the next phase of this conflict. "You look like you haven't slept," Sarah observed, settling into the chair across from him with Emma while Grace continued sleeping. "Is everything okay?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation, knowing that Rebecca's death would devastate Sarah's hope of finding safe passage to a new life. But she deserved the truth, regardless of how difficult it was to hear. He explained about Rebecca's accident, watching Sarah's face pale as the implications became clear. She held Emma closer, her maternal instincts responding to the increased threat level, even as her mind processed the strategic disaster that had just befallen their cause. "So we're on our own," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Not entirely," Marcus replied, producing the maps and documentation he'd been studying through the night. "Rebecca's death eliminates the Oregon option, but it also reveals something important about the Morrison family's methods." Over the past week, Marcus had been developing contingency plans based on his construction project management experience. Complex projects required multiple backup strategies when primary approaches failed, and protecting Sarah's family was proving to be the most complex project of his life. They killed Rebecca because she was the central coordinator, Marcus explained, pointing to connections he'd mapped between various network members. But that also means they're relying on centralized control of their own operations. If we can disrupt their command structure, ... What are you suggesting? Sarah asked, though her expression suggested she already understood the direction of his thinking. We stop running and start fighting back. Rebecca's death proves they're willing to commit murder to get you back, which means surrender isn't an option. But it also means they're operating outside legal constraints, which gives us opportunities they probably haven't considered. Marcus had spent the sleepless night developing a strategy that violated every instinct toward caution and safety he'd developed over 2 years of isolation. Instead of continuing to react defensively to Morrison family initiatives, he proposed taking offensive action designed to expose their criminal activities and force them into positions where their wealth and connections became liabilities rather than advantages. The money laundering you mentioned, Marcus continued, spreading financial documents across the coffee table. If we can document that connection and get it to the right journalists, the Morrison family's political protection disappears overnight. Sarah studied the materials Marcus had assembled: bank records, business filings, and corporate documents that painted a complex picture of financial relationships between Morrison Industries, her father's medical practice, and several shell companies that existed primarily to obscure money transfers. I have access to more detailed records, Sarah admitted. My father kept backup files at our house, thinking I was too naive to understand what they represented. But getting to them would require going back to Billings, Marcus finished, into the heart of Morrison territory, where they'll be watching for exactly that kind of move. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. Instead of continuing to hide from the Morrison family's resources, they would use Sarah's inside knowledge to gather evidence that could destroy the criminal conspiracy protecting Bradley's custody claims. But the operation would require Sarah to temporarily return to Billings and access files hidden in her father's house, while Marcus coordinated with investigative journalists who specialized in exposing corruption among wealthy families. It's insane, Sarah said, bouncing Emma gently as the baby fussed. If they catch me in Billings... They're going to catch you eventually anyway, Marcus replied grimly. Rebecca's death proves they have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Our only chance is to go on offense before they eliminate everyone who might help us. As they refined the operational details, Marcus found himself drawing on skills he'd never expected to need again. His construction business had required careful coordination between multiple contractors, precise timing of complex operations, and contingency planning for scenarios where equipment failures or weather delays could destroy entire projects. Protecting Sarah and the twins was proving to require the same systematic approach, with the added complexity that failure would result in death or imprisonment rather than financial loss. The first phase involved establishing secure communications with investigative journalists who had previously exposed corruption in Montana's political and business communities. Marcus used his ham radio network to make contact with people whose identities couldn't be tracked through conventional surveillance methods. Jenny Walsh, an investigative reporter for the Helena Independent Record, had built her career on stories that powerful families preferred to keep buried. When Marcus outlined the Morrison case during a carefully encrypted radio conversation, her interest was immediate and intense. I've been watching Morrison Industries for 3 years, Jenny explained through the static-filled connection. There have been persistent rumors about money laundering and political corruption, but no one's been willing to provide documentation. If your friend has access to actual financial records, she does, Marcus confirmed. But obtaining them requires a high-risk operation in hostile territory. Jenny outlined her own contacts within federal law enforcement agencies that specialized in financial crimes. If Sarah could provide sufficient documentation, the case could potentially trigger federal investigations that would overwhelm the Morrison family's local political connections. But the evidence has to be ironclad, Jenny warned. These people have enough influence to destroy anyone who comes after them with insufficient proof. The second phase involved planning Sarah's infiltration of her father's house in Billings, a mission that would require precise timing and extensive backup support. Marcus studied architectural plans, security camera positions, and neighborhood patrol patterns while developing multiple extraction routes for different contingencies. The key is making it look like a burglary, Marcus explained as they refined the operational timeline. If they think someone randomly broke in looking for valuables, they won't immediately connect it to our larger strategy. Sarah would have approximately 20 minutes to locate and photograph the financial records hidden in her father's home office before neighbors or security systems could summon law enforcement. Marcus would coordinate with a team of volunteers from the domestic violence network, people who remained committed despite Rebecca's death, to provide perimeter security and emergency extraction if the mission went wrong. What about Emma and Grace? Sarah asked, the question that had been underlying all their planning. They stay here with me, Marcus replied firmly. This mission is dangerous enough without trying to protect newborns during a potential firefight. The maternal conflict in Sarah's expression was heartbreaking. Every instinct demanded that she never be separated from her daughters, but practical necessity required that she leave them in safety while undertaking the most dangerous mission of her life. They'll be safer here than anywhere else, Marcus assured her. I've upgraded the defensive system since the tactical team's visit. And if something happens to you in Billings, at least the twins will be with someone committed to protecting them. Sarah spent the next day preparing for a mission that could either liberate her family from the Morrison threat or result in her capture and permanent separation from her daughters. She photographed every document she could remember from her father's files, creating visual references that would help her locate the most critical evidence quickly. More importantly, she recorded detailed video messages for Emma and Grace, explaining her choices and expressing her love in case she didn't survive to tell them in person. If something happens to me, Sarah told Marcus as they finalized preparations, promise me you'll make sure they understand why I took this risk. I want them to know their mother fought for their freedom, even if she couldn't be there to see them grow up. Marcus made the promise, though he had no intention of allowing Sarah to face this danger alone. His own role in the operation involved more than coordination and communication. If the mission went wrong, he would do whatever was necessary to ensure she returned safely to her daughter's dot. As evening approached and departure time neared, Marcus found himself watching Sarah feed the twins one last time before entrusting them to his care. The domestic scene was so peaceful that it seemed insane to risk destroying it, for the uncertain possibility of exposing crimes that might never face prosecution. But Rebecca Martinez's death had eliminated the luxury of passive resistance. Morrison family's escalation to murder proved they would never stop pursuing Sarah and the twins, which meant the only path to safety lay through actively destroying their ability to threaten anyone. Are you ready? Marcus asked as Sarah prepared to leave for Billings. No, she replied honestly. But ready doesn't matter anymore. This is what has to be done. As Sarah drove away into the Montana darkness, heading toward a mission that could save or destroy everything they'd built together, Marcus settled into the vigilant routine of caring for newborn twins while monitoring radio communications that would determine whether he was about to become a single father to children who weren't biologically his own. Outside, motion sensors detected the first surveillance vehicles taking position around his property. The Morrison family knew something was happening, and they were preparing to respond with whatever force proved necessary. The next 12 hours would determine whether courage and careful planning could triumph over unlimited resources and political corruption. Or whether Marcus Sullivan would spend the rest of his life protecting two little girls, whose mother had died trying to give them freedom. Sarah's hands trembled as she adjusted the black ski mask outside her childhood home at 2:47 a.m. The elegant Tudor mansion on Billings, most exclusive street, looked exactly as she remembered: manicured gardens, imported stone facade, and security cameras that her father had installed after a business rival received federal indictments for tax evasion. What she hadn't expected was how returning to this place would flood her with memories of the frightened girl who'd once believed her father's approval was the most important thing in the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. 24 years after Dr. Richard Chun had brought his family to this house as symbols of his American success, his daughter was breaking in as a fugitive seeking evidence to destroy everything he'd built. Through her earpiece, Marcus's voice provided steady guidance from his position 15 miles away, where he was monitoring Emma and Grace between radio checks with their surveillance team. "Security system shows green across all sectors," Marcus reported quietly. "Jenny Walsh confirms federal agents are standing by in Helena. You have approximately 18 minutes before the next neighborhood patrol." Sarah moved through the shadows of her father's meticulously maintained garden, following a route she'd planned using childhood memories of sneaking out to meet friends her parents disapproved of. The basement window she'd used for teenage escapades remained unlocked, a security oversight that reflected Dr. Chun's assumption that his reputation would protect him from consequences. Inside the house, Sarah felt the familiar weight of her father's expectations pressing down like a physical force. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen art piece, every detail of decor reflected his obsession with projecting success and respectability to colleagues who would never fully accept an immigrant surgeon regardless of his achievements. But tonight, Sarah wasn't the obedient daughter who'd once desperately sought approval from people who viewed her as an investment in their social climbing ambitions. She was a mother fighting for her children's freedom, and that identity made her more dangerous than anyone in her family had ever imagined. The home office occupied the entire third floor, a shrine to Dr. Chen's professional accomplishments that doubled as the command center for financial activities that would send him to federal prison if properly documented. Sarah moved through the familiar space with surgical precision, locating the hidden safe behind her father's medical degrees within 90 seconds. The combination was her mother's birthday, a sentimental weakness that revealed how Dr. Chun's emotional connections had become subordinated to his financial ambitions. Inside the safe, Sarah found exactly what Rebecca Martinez had died trying to obtain: comprehensive records of money laundering operations that connected Morrison Industries to offshore accounts, shell companies, and cash transfers that had been disguised as medical equipment purchases. "Jackpot," Sarah whispered into her microphone as she photographed page after page of incriminating documentation. Financial records going back 7 years, bank account numbers, wire transfer authorizations, with Bradley's signature and what looks like payoff schedules to county officials. Marcus's voice carried relief and tension in equal measure. "How much longer do you need?" 10 more minutes to photograph everything. "The records are more comprehensive than I expected." They kept meticulous documentation of every illegal transaction. As Sarah continued photographing evidence that would destroy both families' carefully constructed facades, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Among the financial records were medical files detailing Bradley's history of violent behavior, including psychiatric evaluations that had been suppressed through family influence. The documents revealed that Bradley Morrison III had been hospitalized 3 times for alcohol-induced psychotic episodes that resulted in serious injuries to hospital staff. His family had used political connections to seal the records and prevent criminal charges, while ensuring he received private treatment that focused on managing symptoms rather than addressing Underlying behavioral problems. More disturbing were consultation notes between Dr. Chun and Morrison family lawyers, discussing genetic concerns about children produced by Sarah's marriage to Bradley. The files suggested both families were aware that Bradley's psychological instability could be inherited by his offspring, but viewed this as a manageable risk compared to the financial benefits of the arranged marriage. "Marcus," Sarah whispered. Urgently, they knew. Both families knew Bradley was dangerous when they forced me to marry him. There are psychiatric reports documenting violent episodes, genetic counseling sessions about hereditary mental illness, everything. The implications were staggering. Not only had Sarah been sacrificed to a marriage with a known violent psychopath, but her parents and the Morrison family had planned to monitor any children from the union for signs of psychological problems. That could be managed through private medical intervention. Emma and Grace weren't just heirs to the Morrison fortune, they were potential subjects for ongoing psychological manipulation designed to ensure they never challenged family authority the way their mother eventually had. Sarah's maternal rage provided energy that overrode exhaustion and fear as she documented every page of evidence that revealed the conspiracy surrounding her marriage and daughter's futures. These weren't just financial crimes, but systematic abuse designed to control multiple generations through arranged marriages and psychological manipulation. 15 minutes elapsed, Marcus reported with growing urgency. Security patrol should be starting their next round in 3 minutes. Sarah was photographing the final folder when footsteps echoed from the first floor. Someone had entered the house through the front door, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "We have a problem," Sarah whispered immediately, switching off her phone's camera flash and moving to the office window that overlooked the street. 2 additional vehicles had arrived while she was absorbed in documenting evidence. Black sedans with government license plates that suggested federal surveillance rather than local law enforcement. Her infiltration had somehow been detected, and people with serious authority were responding to contain whatever damage she might cause. "Marcus, there are federal agents outside and someone just entered the house," Sarah reported, feeling her heart rate spike to dangerous levels. "This might be a trap." Marcus's response was immediate and decisive. "Emergency extraction protocol. Move to the basement window immediately. Do not attempt to gather additional evidence." But Sarah realized that escape might no longer be possible. The agents outside were positioning themselves to cover all possible exit routes, while whoever had entered the house was moving steadily upward through the floors. She was trapped in her father's office with evidence that could destroy 2 powerful families, evidence that would disappear forever if she didn't find a way to transmit it before being captured. "I'm sending the photos now," Sarah said, activating a secure upload protocol that Rebecca Martinez had taught her for exactly this scenario. "If they capture me, at least Jenny Walsh will have the documentation needed to pursue federal charges." The footsteps reached the 2nd floor, accompanied by voices she recognized with stomach-dropping certainty. Her father was in the house, along with someone whose authoritative tone suggested law enforcement or federal investigation. Sarah completed the upload process just as the office door opened to reveal Dr. Richard Chun, flanked by 2 FBI agents, whose expressions combined professional competence with personal distaste for their current assignment. "Hello, Sarah," her father said with the calm disappointment he'd perfected during her childhood. "I believe you have something that belongs to our family." The lead FBI agent stepped forward with credentials that identified him as Special Agent Robert Manning from the Bureau's White-Collar Crime Division. His presence confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The federal authorities weren't here to investigate the Morrison family's crimes, but to contain evidence that could embarrass politically connected families. "Sarah Chun Morrison, you're under arrest for burglary, theft of confidential documents, and violation of federal custody orders," Agent Manning announced with practiced efficiency. "You have the right to remain attorney." The documents I just uploaded will destroy both families' political protection. Sarah interrupted, finding courage in the knowledge that her mission had succeeded despite her capture. Every bank account, every payoff, every cover-up is documented, with signatures and dates. Dr. Chun's composure cracked slightly as he absorbed the implications of what his daughter had accomplished. For 24 years, he'd viewed Sarah as an investment in his social climbing ambitions, never imagining she possessed the intelligence and determination to threaten everything he'd built. "You foolish girl," he said with genuine anger breaking through his usual controlled demeanor. "Do you have any idea what you've just destroyed? Not just our family's position, but your own daughter's futures." The Morrison Trust Fund would have provided Emma and Grace with every advantage in life. Sarah felt a surge of protective fury. That made her father's threats seem insignificant compared to the maternal instincts driving her actions. "I would rather raise my daughters in poverty than watch them grow up as prisoners in golden cages," she replied with absolute conviction. "At least now they'll have the chance to choose their own lives instead of having their futures decided by people who view children as investments." Agent Manning interrupted their family confrontation with bureaucratic efficiency that suggested, "This arrest was simply another case file requiring completion. Mrs. Morrison, you need to come with us now. Your children are in federal protective custody, pending resolution of the custody dispute between yourself and your husband." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. While she'd been gathering evidence in Billings, federal agents had been moving against Marcus and the twins. Her mission had succeeded in obtaining documentation that could destroy the Morrison family's criminal enterprise, but the cost might be permanent separation from Emma and Grace. "Where are my daughters?" Sarah demanded, her voice carrying the desperate edge of a mother whose children had been threatened. "In appropriate care facilities while the courts determine their best interests," Agent Manning replied with bureaucratic indifference. "Your recent behavior has raised serious questions about your fitness as a parent." As federal agents escorted Sarah from her childhood home toward an uncertain future, she caught a final glimpse of the Tudor mansion that had represented everything her father valued above family bonds and personal integrity. The house looked exactly the same as it had during her privileged childhood, but Sarah finally understood that its elegant facade had always concealed the foundation built on exploitation and control. Through the agent's radio communications, Sarah learned that simultaneous raids had been conducted across 3 counties, targeting every location associated with the underground network that had tried to help her escape the Morrison family's control. The federal response had been swift, comprehensive, and clearly coordinated with people who possessed detailed knowledge of the network's operations and safe houses. Someone had betrayed not just Sarah's mission, but the entire organization that specialized in helping women and children escape domestic violence. The implications were devastating for hundreds of families who depended on the network for protection from abusers with wealth and political connections. As the federal convoy transported Sarah toward detention facilities in Helena, she found herself thinking not about her own uncertain fate, but about Marcus alone in his cabin with Emma and Grace, probably unaware that federal agents were already moving to separate him from the children he'd risked everything to protect. The upload of financial evidence would eventually trigger investigations that could destroy both the Morrison and Chun families' criminal enterprises. But justice moved slowly through federal bureaucracy, while separated children suffered immediately from traumatic removals that could damage them for life. Sarah had succeeded in gathering evidence that could free her daughters from the Morrison family's control, but she might have lost them in the process to a federal system that prioritized political stability over protecting innocent children from powerful families who viewed them as property. Through the vehicle's window, she watched the Montana landscape pass by in darkness, knowing that somewhere in those mountains, Marcus Sullivan was probably discovering that loving someone meant accepting risks that could destroy everything you held precious. The woman who had once been content to live as her father's obedient daughter and Bradley's submissive wife, was now facing federal charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. But for the first time in her life, Sarah Chun Morrison felt genuinely proud of the choices she'd made, even if those choices cost her everything she'd ever hoped to have with the man who'd taught her that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal price. Her daughters would grow up knowing their mother had chosen their freedom over her own safety, and that knowledge might be the only legacy she could leave them if the federal justice system proved as corrupt as the families it was protecting. Marcus was feeding Grace her 3 a.m. bottle when the helicopters appeared over his cabin, their searchlights turning the Montana darkness into an aggressive artificial dawn. Emma slept peacefully in her makeshift crib, oblivious to the federal task force that was surrounding the only home she'd ever known with military precision. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus 2 years ago. He'd retreated to this isolated cabin, seeking escape from responsibility and human connection. Now he found himself holding a 5-day-old infant, while federal agents prepared to separate him from the children who had become his reason for living. Through his reinforced windows, Marcus counted 8 vehicles positioning themselves to block every possible escape route. These weren't the private contractors who'd failed to breach his defenses a week earlier, but genuine federal agents with legitimate authority and unlimited resources. His secure radio crackled with Jenny Walsh's urgent voice from Helena. "Marcus, Sarah's been arrested." The financial evidence uploaded successfully before her capture, but federal agents raided every safe house in the network simultaneously. Someone provided detailed intelligence about the entire operation. Marcus felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. The federal response had been too coordinated, too comprehensive to be reactive. Someone with inside knowledge had betrayed not just Sarah's infiltration mission, but the entire Underground Railroad that had tried to protect her and the twins. Grace finished her bottle and settled against his shoulder with the complete trust that only newborns possessed. The weight of her tiny body reminded Marcus that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether Emma and Grace grew up in loving homes or became casualties of a political system that protected wealthy families over innocent children. The federal megaphone activated with bureaucratic authority. "Marcus Sullivan, this is Special Agent Patricia Reeves, FBI Child Abduction Response Team. We have federal warrants for the recovery of Emma and Grace Morrison. Please exit the cabin with the children and submit to lawful authority." Marcus keyed his radio to broadcast on emergency frequencies that would create official records of everything that followed. If federal agents were going to separate him from the twins, he wanted multiple witnesses documenting their methods and justifications. "This is Marcus Sullivan at Glacier County, coordinates 47.8396 north, 114.1786 west. Federal agents are demanding surrender of infant children currently in my protective custody. I am requesting legal representation and clarification of authority under which these children are being removed from a safe environment." The response came not through the megaphone, but via his landline telephone. Someone had done sufficient research to obtain his unlisted number, suggesting surveillance that had been ongoing for days or weeks. "Mr. Sullivan, this is Agent Reeves. I understand your concerns, but we have federal custody orders issued by Judge Morrison in Billings County. These children are being removed for their own protection, while their parents' fitness is being evaluated." Marcus recognized the legal framework being used against him, the same political connections that had protected Bradley Morrison's violent history were now being weaponized to separate the twins from anyone who might interfere with Morrison family control. "Judge Morrison is Bradley Morrison's uncle," Marcus replied calmly. "Federal custody orders issued by biased relatives don't supersede constitutional protections against unlawful seizure. Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to gather the children's belongings and exit voluntarily. After that, we'll be forced to enter and remove them ourselves." Marcus looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in his arms, then across the room at Emma, who was beginning to stir in her crib. These tiny girls had no understanding of the political force buying used to manipulate their lives, but they would bear the emotional scars of traumatic separation for years to come. The decision Marcus faced was impossible: resist federal authority and risk both children being injured during a forced entry, or surrender them voluntarily to people who viewed them as property rather than precious lives deserving protection. But as he studied the peaceful expressions on both babies' faces, Marcus realized there was a third option, one that required him to trust the legal system. Sarah had risked everything to expose. He activated his secure radio connection to Jenny Walsh. "Jenny, are you recording this federal operation?" "Every word, Marcus. I have contacts at 3 news networks standing by with Sarah's financial evidence. If federal agents remove those children without proper legal justification, it becomes part of the story about Morrison family corruption." Marcus understood what Jenny was offering: the chance to turn the twins' removal into a public relations disaster that would force federal authorities to justify their actions under media scrutiny, rather than operating in secrecy. "Agent Reeves," Marcus called through his reinforced door, "I'm willing to surrender the children voluntarily, but only with full media documentation of this federal operation. If you're operating under legitimate authority, you shouldn't object to public oversight." The silence that followed suggested Agent Reeves was consulting with superiors who hadn't anticipated their operation being subjected to journalistic examination. Federal agents were accustomed to conducting child removals away from public attention, relying on sealed court orders and confidential proceedings to avoid accountability. "Mr. Sullivan, this is a federal law enforcement operation, not a media event," Agent Reeves finally replied. "Exit the cabin now with the children, or we will enter and remove them by force." Marcus made his choice based on what was best for Emma and Grace, rather than his own desire to protect them from separation. Forcing federal agents to break down doors while he held newborn infants would traumatize the children and provide legal justification for whatever charges prosecutors wanted to pursue. Instead, he carefully gathered both babies, their bottles, diapers, and the few belongings Sarah had managed to bring during her desperate flight. As he prepared to surrender the children who had given his life meaning again, Marcus made a promise that no federal agent or corrupt judge could prevent him from keeping. "I'm going to find you," he whispered to Emma and Grace as he held them. "One final time. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm going to make sure you're safe and loved." Marcus opened his cabin door and stepped into the harsh glare of federal searchlights, carrying 2 tiny girls whose only crime was being born to parents who had challenged powerful families accustomed to treating people as property. Agent Reeves approached with professional efficiency, flanked by social workers whose job was to minimize trauma during child removals that were often more about politics than protection. "Mr. Sullivan, please transfer the children to our custody," Agent Reeves requested with bureaucratic politeness that couldn't disguise the underlying coercion. Marcus looked into the agent's eyes, seeing someone who was probably a decent person, forced to execute policies that served political interests rather than children's welfare. "These babies have been in my care for a week," Marcus said quietly. "They know my voice, my touch, my heartbeat. Separating them from the only stability they've known will cause psychological damage that could affect them for life." "Mr. Sullivan, that's not your decision to make," Agent Reeves replied, though her expression suggested she understood the validity of his concerns. As Marcus transferred Emma and Grace to federal agents who would transport them to strangers in unfamiliar environments, he felt something breaking inside his chest that was worse than the grief he'd experienced after Jennifer's death. This wasn't loss through tragedy, but forced separation through systematic injustice. The babies began crying as they were placed in federal vehicles, their tiny voices carrying across the Montana wilderness like accusations against every adult who had prioritized political considerations over their emotional welfare. Marcus watched the federal convoy disappear into darkness, carrying away the children who had taught him that love was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any consequence that powerful enemies could impose. But Agent Reeves remained behind, her expression suggesting she had additional business to conduct. "Mr. Sullivan, you're under federal investigation for harboring fugitives and interfering with lawful custody proceedings. I strongly advise you to obtain legal representation and avoid any further contact with Sarah Chin Morrison or attempts to locate the children." Marcus understood the threat being delivered with bureaucratic courtesy. The Morrison family's political connections extended deep, enough into federal law enforcement to ensure that anyone who interfered with their objectives would face criminal prosecution designed to destroy their ability to provide future resistance. As the federal agents departed and silence returned to his cabin, Marcus Sullivan found himself alone again in the isolation he'd once sought as refuge from responsibility and human connection. But this time, the isolation wasn't chosen. It was imposed by people who used federal authority to protect wealthy families from the consequences of their crimes. The empty cabin felt like a tomb, filled with reminders of the life he'd briefly shared with Sarah, Emma, and Grace. Baby bottles in the sink, tiny clothes drying by the fireplace, the makeshift cribs he'd built with such hope for their future together. Marcus activated his radio to contact Jenny Walsh, knowing that the fight for Emma and Grace's freedom was just beginning, and that their only chance for justice lay in exposing the corruption that had just torn their family apart. 6 months after the federal raids, Marcus Sullivan stood in the lobby of the Helena Federal Building watching CNN broadcast breaking news that would destroy two of Montana's most powerful families forever. The financial evidence Sarah had uploaded from her father's safe was finally bearing fruit, but justice had moved with glacial slowness while Emma and Grace remained separated from everyone who loved them. Federal prosecutors announced sweeping indictments today against Morrison Industries and several Montana political figures in what investigators are calling the largest money laundering conspiracy in state history. The news anchor reported as Marcus waited for his appointment with the lead prosecutor. Jenny Walsh's investigative series had been running for 3 months, methodically exposing every detail of the Morrison-Ching financial empire while public outrage built to levels that made political protection impossible. The psychiatric records documenting Bradley Morrison's violent history had proven especially damaging, revealing a pattern of cover-ups that extended to multiple law enforcement agencies. But the real breakthrough had come from an unexpected source agent. Patricia Reeves, the FBI supervisor who had overseen the twins' removal from Marcus's cabin. Haunted by her role in separating infants from their protective caregiver to serve political interests, she had quietly provided internal documents proving the federal operation had been coordinated with Morrison family lawyers rather than legitimate child welfare concerns. "Mr. Sullivan," a familiar voice called across the lobby. Marcus turned to see Sarah approaching with a confidence he'd never witnessed during their week together in the cabin. 6 months of federal detention pending trial had transformed her from a frightened refugee into someone who understood exactly how powerful institutions operated and could be challenged. "Sarah," Marcus said, feeling emotions he'd been suppressing for half a year flood through his system. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," she replied with a smile that carried both pain and hope. Federal prosecutors offered complete immunity in exchange for testimony against both families. Apparently, documented evidence of money laundering overcomes even the Morrison family's political connections. They walked together toward the prosecutor's office where Marcus would provide testimony about the twins' care during their brief time together. But more importantly, today would determine whether Emma and Grace could be released from federal custody to people who viewed them as precious children rather than Political assets. The twins had spent 6 months in a federal facility designed for children caught in custody disputes involving national security concerns. Despite the clinical environment, they had thrived physically, but Marcus worried constantly about the emotional impact of being separated from any consistent caregiver who could provide the unconditional love every child deserved. "Have you seen them?" Marcus asked as they approached the prosecutor's office. "Twice a week for supervised visits," Sarah replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "They're beautiful, healthy, and starting to smile more. But Marcus, they don't know me anymore. 6 months is a lifetime at their age." The pain in Sarah's voice reflected the cruel irony of their situation. By fighting to protect her daughters from the Morrison family's control, she had lost the crucial bonding period that established maternal connection. The twins who had once known her heartbeat and voice were now strangers, who associated comfort with institutional caregivers rather than their biological mother. "They'll remember," Marcus assured her, though he harbored the same fears about his own relationship with Emma and Grace. Love doesn't disappear just because it's interrupted. Inside the prosecutor's office, they met Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, whose reputation for pursuing corruption cases had made him the federal government's point person for dismantling the Morrison conspiracy. His desk was covered with financial documents, psychiatric evaluations, and legal briefs that represented months of building criminal cases against defendants who had never expected to face prosecution. "Ms. Morrison, Mr. Sullivan," Rodriguez began formally, "I wanted to personally thank you for the courage you showed in exposing this conspiracy. Without the evidence you gathered and the testimony you've provided, these prosecutions would have been impossible." But Marcus wasn't interested in gratitude. He wanted to know when Emma and Grace could return to a real family environment rather than continuing to live in federal custody while prosecutors built their cases. "What's the timeline for reuniting the children with their mother?" Marcus asked directly. Rodriguez consulted his files before responding. "Federal custody will be terminated as soon as we resolve the underlying legal issues. Bradley Morrison III has been declared mentally incompetent to exercise parental rights based on the psychiatric evidence you discovered. His family's financial assets have been frozen pending criminal proceedings, so they lack resources to continue fighting custody battles." Sarah's relief was visible as she absorbed this information. For 6 months, she had lived with the fear that Morrison family lawyers would find ways to maintain legal claims to her daughters, despite the mounting evidence of criminal activity and psychological instability. "However," Rodriguez continued, "there's a complication regarding Mr. Sullivan's role in the children's future care." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he anticipated whatever bureaucratic obstacle was about to be raised. During their federal custody evaluation, both children showed strong attachment behaviors toward Mr. Sullivan during his supervised visits. They respond to his voice, seek comfort from his presence, and demonstrate clear recognition patterns that suggest deep emotional bonding. Marcus had been visiting Emma and Grace twice weekly, maintaining contact despite federal warnings about interfering with ongoing investigations. Watching them grow and develop while being unable to provide daily care had been emotionally devastating. But he had refused to abandon them when they needed consistency most. "What kind of complication?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying new tension. "The children's psychological evaluation recommends against separating them from Mr. Sullivan, who appears to serve as their primary attachment figure," Rodriguez explained. "Federal Family Services suggests a gradual transition that maintains his role in their care while rebuilding their relationship with their biological mother." The proposal that emerged from weeks of evaluation and planning was unprecedented in Marcus's experience. Sarah would be granted full legal custody of Emma and Grace, but federal child welfare experts recommended that Marcus continue serving as their primary caregiver while Sarah rebuilt the maternal bond that custody battles. had disrupted. Essentially, you'd be co-parenting, Rodriguez explained, with legal recognition that Mr. Sullivan has served as the children's psychological father during their most crucial developmental period. Marcus looked at Sarah, wondering how she felt about sharing parental responsibilities with someone who had originally been a stranger providing emergency shelter. The arrangement would give Emma and Grace the stability they needed while allowing Sarah to gradually rebuild her relationship with daughters she'd sacrificed everything to protect. "What do you think?" Sarah asked quietly, her expression revealing both hope and uncertainty about this unexpected path forward. Marcus thought about the week he'd spent caring for newborn twins while their mother risked her life to gather evidence that would protect their future. He remembered the weight of tiny bodies sleeping against his chest, the trust in their eyes when he fed them bottles in the Montana wilderness, the promise he'd made to find them no matter how long it took. "I think Emma and Grace deserve to be raised by people who love them more than anything else in the world," Marcus replied. "If that includes both of us, then that's what we'll figure out together." 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in his rebuilt cabin watching Sarah feed Emma while Grace slept peacefully in the crib he'd expanded to accommodate growing babies. The federal investigations continued, with both families facing decades of imprisonment for crimes that had been hidden behind facades of respectability and political influence, but inside the cabin that had once housed only isolation and grief. A new kind of family was learning to build love on foundations of shared sacrifice, rather than traditional expectations. Sarah had chosen to relocate to Montana rather than returning to the privileged world that had treated her as property. The money laundering prosecutions would eventually provide financial compensation for victims of the Morrison III conspiracy. But Sarah was discovering that freedom meant more than financial security. It meant choosing relationships based on mutual respect rather than political calculation. Marcus had transformed from a broken widower seeking escape from human connection into someone who understood that the greatest honors in life came from protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Emma and Grace had taught him that love multiplied when shared rather than diminishing, and that the family he'd lost could be honored by creating new bonds based on the same unconditional commitment. As evening fell over the Montana wilderness, Marcus watched Sarah sing lullabies to daughters who were slowly learning to trust their mother's voice again. The twins who had been born into a world of political manipulation and family control were growing up surrounded by people who valued their happiness over any other consideration. Outside, the isolation that had once represented escape from responsibility now provided protection for a family that had been forged through crisis and commitment rather than blood or legal ceremony. The cabin that had housed only grief for 2 years was filled with the sounds of children being loved by adults who had chosen them over their own safety. Marcus Sullivan had sought solitude in the Montana mountains to escape from the possibility of losing people he cared about. Instead, he had discovered that the greatest risk in life wasn't loving someone who might be taken away, it was failing to love anyone enough to fight for their protection when they needed it most. Emma and Grace would grow up knowing they were wanted not because of their genetic heritage or financial value, but because 2 adults had looked at vulnerable babies and decided their welfare was worth any sacrifice. And in the end, that was the only kind of family that ever really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.